Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
I remember the morning of my wedding like it was a cruel joke I couldn't wake up from, the kind of day that you plan for months, every detail meticulously arranged, every expectation carefully imagined, only to have it ripped away before it even begins. Because the people you thought would be there for you chose to be somewhere else entirely. I woke up with the excitement I always imagined I would feel, the kind of nervous energy that makes your stomach twist in anticipation, and I expected to see my parents helping with the last-minute details, offering words of encouragement or even just the small gestures that make a day like this feel monumental. But instead, the house was eerily quiet, and my phone was already buzzing with messages from friends telling me they were outside, ready to help with the decorations, and that's when I saw the first message from my mom, which didn't say congratulations, didn't ask if I was ready, didn't offer even a hint of pride. It simply said, "We're heading over to Ashley's for her boyfriend's birthday dinner. We'll be late for yours." I stared at it for a long time, my heart sinking in a way that made my chest feel heavy, my stomach not tight, because I had already known that Ashley had a way of always being the center of attention, that she had a way of bending our parents to her will. But I hadn't expected it to be on the day I was supposed to be the one at the center, the one whose life was being celebrated. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I just sat there, staring at the message over and over, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal and confusion, and wondering how my parents could possibly think this was acceptable. How they could casually abandon me for something as insignificant as a birthday dinner for a man who hadn't even spent half as much time building a relationship with them as I had, the irony and cruelty of it hitting me all at once, leaving me paralyzed for a moment because this was supposed to be my day, my one opportunity to be the bride, to have every person I loved there for me, and instead I felt invisible in my own life, a spectator to everyone else's priorities. I didn't cry. I stayed silent because I had learned long ago that arguing with them never worked, that expressing my hurt only led to guilt trips and explanations that made me feel like I was being unreasonable, so I stayed silent. I let my anger and disappointment simmer quietly inside me while I went through the motions, letting my friends help me into my dress, making sure my makeup was flawless, rehearsing the steps down the aisle in my head, all the while imagining my parents walking into Ashley's apartment, laughing, clinking glasses, and acting like they had done the right thing. I could hear my heart beating in the room, fast and sharp, a reminder that despite their absence, I still had something that day that couldn't be taken from me, which was the man I was about to marry, who stood patiently outside the door, holding flowers, waiting for the moment he would see me, and even though I wanted to throw my phone across the room, even though I wanted to call them and tell them exactly what I thought about their choices, I didn't, because I knew that my silence was more powerful than any words I could speak at that moment, and I let it stay that way. When we arrived at the venue, I realized that the people who truly mattered had shown up, my friends, colleagues, and family who genuinely cared, and as I walked down the aisle, I kept my eyes forward, not seeking approval from the people who had chosen Ashley's plans over mine, and I noticed the absence of my parents like a sharp ache that refused to fade, and I carried it with me, a quiet weight behind every smile and every laugh, because the truth was that I had imagined this day being filled with love and support from the people who were supposed to be my foundation, and instead it was a test of my strength, a reminder that the people who are supposed to be there for you sometimes fail you in ways you don't expect, and that the silence of those you love can speak louder than any words. After the ceremony, when the champagne was poured and the speeches started, I didn't feel the warmth I expected. I felt a hollow echo, a gap where my parents should have been, and I caught sight of Ashley's posts online, pictures from the dinner she had thrown with them, all smiling, all congratulating her boyfriend, and I felt the sharp sting of injustice again, but I reminded myself quietly that the day was mine, not theirs, and while they were busy living in someone else's spotlight, I was living in my own, and I would remember that long after the laughter of that birthday dinner had faded. By the time the night was winding down, I was exhausted in every sense, emotionally and physically, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was clarity, because I realized that the silence I had held, The quiet endurance I had maintained while everyone else made choices that hurt me was not weakness, it was preparation, and I understood then that what I had endured that day, the abandonment, the betrayal, the disregard, was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the way I would prove to them that their choices had consequences, and I would do it without shouting, without confrontation, but with something far more powerful, something they would not see coming. And as I stood there, holding my husband's hand and watching our friends laugh and celebrate, I whispered to myself a promise that no one else could hear. I will have the last word, and it will be brilliant. For the days after the wedding, I kept myself busy, diving into work and small projects I had been putting off, answering calls from relatives who had managed to make it to the ceremony with polite congratulations, and quietly watching the ripples of that day settle into a pattern I had already come to expect from my family, which was that they treated everything as if it were a choice of preference rather than an obligation, as if their attention was a currency I had to earn instead of something that should have been freely given. And I realized that the anger I had felt on the day itself was not going to dissipate simply because time passed, because they had shown me in the clearest way possible who and what mattered to them. And the absence was as sharp as any insult, as cutting as any intentional slight, yet I also understood that the more I let it fester in words, the less control I had over how it affected me. So I decided instead to let the silence of that day live in my mind as a quiet, simmering power, something I could build on rather than something I could allow to break me. I spent one afternoon alone, scrolling through my phone and revisiting the pictures Ashley had posted, her grinning face alongside my parents as if nothing had happened, her boyfriend in the center of the frame, and for a long time, I just stared at the images, letting the frustration build not because it was necessary, but because I needed it to solidify in my mind the pattern of disregard and favoritism that had followed me my entire life, where my accomplishments were quietly dismissed, where my presence was often an afterthought, and where the small victories I achieved never seemed to warrant genuine pride from the people whose approval I had once chased blindly. I could feel my jaw tightening as I read every caption, every tag, every comment, and for a moment I almost considered confronting them directly, almost considered sending a message that would make them squirm with guilt. But then I realized that any action taken in haste would be reactionary and therefore weak compared to the strategy that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind for years, and so I did what I had always done best, which was to hold it in, observe, and let the quiet power of inevitability grow inside me until it was impossible to ignore. The irony, of course, was that while my parents were busy choosing sides on trivial matters, life had already begun to tip in my favor in ways they had no control over, which is why when my uncle's lawyer called me one morning, explaining that I was the sole heir to a portion of his fortune that had been carefully accumulated over decades, I felt a surge of something that was equal parts satisfaction and vindication, because I knew exactly how my parents would react when they realized that the daughter they had ignored, the one who had been silently pushed aside so often, was suddenly in a position of influence and wealth that could not be overlooked, and for the first time in my life, I felt the luxury of having options that they could not dictate or diminish, the kind of options that allow a person to reclaim control over their story, to rewrite the rules in a way that those who had underestimated you never see coming. I did not call them immediately. I did not post about it online or boast to friends. I waited, knowing that anticipation could be just as potent a weapon as any confrontation, and for days I watched the subtle signs of their awareness manifest, small messages that carried an undertone of curiosity, hints of concern disguised as casual check-ins, and it was almost comical to witness the people who had been so indifferent to my life suddenly asking questions that they had never bothered to ask before, pretending that their interest was spontaneous rather than a calculated response to what they now understood to be unavoidable reality. I maintained my composure, spoke with neutral politeness, and let the power of timing carry the weight of my message without me needing to raise my voice or argue my case, because I had learned that the loudest statements often come from silence, from the deliberate withholding of attention until the right moment, and that the most effective revenge is one that is clean, undeniable, and undeniable in its brilliance. In those days, I reflected on the pattern of my life, how often I had been invisible when it suited them, how often I had been expected to remain quiet, to accommodate, to prioritize the happiness of others over my own. And I realized that the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived, the moment when the balance of power shifted subtly yet irrevocably, and I could see it in the tone of their messages, in the timing of their calls. In the cautious way my mother referenced Ashley and her boyfriend, as if to remind me of my supposed inferiority, and I smiled quietly to myself, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I knew that my patience, my silence, and my restraint had been the instruments that created this exact scenario. Where their attention and concern were no longer a given, where their eagerness to participate in my life was contingent on my terms, and where I held the final hand, the one that would allow me to reclaim not just recognition, but control, without ever having to beg or explain or justify myself in a way they could manipulate. By the end of that week, I realized that what had started as a quiet observation had transformed into a strategic advantage, a power shift that was entirely mine to wield. And as I prepared to respond to their first hesitant inquiry about a potential do-over ceremony, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction in knowing that I would not only assert my importance, but also teach them a lesson they would remember. Not through anger, not through recrimination, but through the quiet, undeniable force of timing, strategy, and the kind of revenge that is both clever and morally satisfying, the kind that makes the world feel right because it allows justice to arrive not with a shout, but with the certainty that comes from years of patience and foresight. I waited for them to take the first step, knowing full well that the silence I had held all those years was now my most powerful statement, and that when I finally acted, it would not just be a response. It would be a declaration that I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the invisible sibling, or the silent observer, but the one who had mastered the art of timing, strategy, and the kind of brilliant, emotionally satisfying victory that leaves no doubt about who truly holds the power. I had spent the morning quietly sorting through old emails and messages, not because I expected to find anything of significance, but because I needed to immerse myself in the history of my family's patterns, to understand the way they had operated for decades in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that shaped the way I moved through life. And as I scrolled past the dozens of forgotten threads, I paused on a message from my sister, the same sister whose wedding had become the silent battlefield of our family's attention and priorities, and in that moment I realized that the tone of her words had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, not overtly confrontational, but carrying an undertone of worry and surprise that suggested she had witnessed or learned something that I was not yet privy to. And for a moment I allowed myself the small satisfaction of knowing that the quiet patience I had exercised over years had begun to produce ripples that were reaching even the most indifferent members of my family in ways they could not have anticipated. Her message was simple, deceptively so. She asked why our mother had been crying in her room the night after the wedding, a question that seemed almost innocent on the surface. But the subtext was unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time observing my family's interactions, because the concern embedded in her words betrayed an awareness of consequences that extended beyond the superficialities of congratulations and social etiquette, and I felt a wave of both anticipation and control, knowing that I now held information and leverage that could reshape the narrative entirely, that the silences I had endured and the moments I had allowed to pass unacknowledged were finally accumulating into a force that would command attention not through argument or confrontation, but simply by existing and being undeniable. I crafted my reply with precision, choosing my words carefully, knowing that every sentence carried weight and that even a hint of emotional restraint would amplify the effect of what I intended to communicate. And as I typed, I reflected on the years in which my presence had been taken for granted, the countless times my efforts had been overlooked, the subtle dismissals that had been disguised as advice or concern. And I understood that the power I now wielded came not from loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but from the slow, deliberate accumulation of credibility, patience, and timing, which had allowed me to observe, calculate, and act in a way that was methodical and inevitable rather than reactionary. When I finally sent the message, I did so with a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions that had built up inside me over the years, and I allowed myself to imagine the chain of events that would unfold as she read it. As she realized that her knowledge of our mother's tears was no longer a trivial matter, but a trigger for the kind of reflection and confrontation that had been long overdue in our family dynamic. And in that moment, I felt a clarity of purpose that had nothing to do with revenge in its crude form and everything to do with asserting the undeniable fact that my perspective and my presence mattered, that the years of silence and observation were not wasted, and that when wielded deliberately, the quiet accumulation of information could be more powerful than any outburst of anger or complaint. By the afternoon, her response arrived, and it carried a mixture of confusion, guilt, and a subtle plea for clarification that revealed more about her own anxieties than it did about mine. And as I read her words, I realized that the strategic advantage I had cultivated through restraint was now manifesting in real-time consequences, shaping the way my family moved and communicated, forcing them to confront realities that they had ignored or dismissed for far too long, and I felt an almost dizzying sense of control, tempered only by the knowledge that the true measure of influence is not in immediate reactions, but in the sustained shift in perception and behavior that follows. I spent the remainder of the day reflecting on the complex interplay of emotion, power, and timing, considering how every past incident, every slight, every overlooked contribution had converged to create this moment in which a simple message could carry implications far beyond its words, and I allowed myself to feel the quiet satisfaction of understanding that my strategy was unfolding as intended, that the careful cultivation of patience, discretion, and observation had positioned me in a place where my actions were not only acknowledged but anticipated, where my family could no longer ignore the consequences of their choices, and where the long-overdue recognition of my significance was no longer dependent on arguments, explanations, or demonstrations, but simply on the unavoidable clarity of reality that I had worked to shape with deliberate precision. As evening fell, I anticipated the next moves, knowing that the ripples created by my reply would provoke responses that revealed character, priorities, and insecurities, and that each interaction would serve as both a mirror and a measure of the dynamics I had long studied, allowing me to navigate the unfolding events with the same meticulous attention to detail that had brought me to this point. And I understood with certainty that the power I now possessed was not momentary, but enduring, forged through the consistent application of strategy, awareness, and patience, and that the simple act of sending one carefully considered message had shifted the course of our family interactions in ways that were subtle, unavoidable, and deeply consequential, setting the stage for a confrontation and acknowledgement that would arrive not through force, but through the inexorable and undeniable weight of truth. In the quiet that followed, I realized that the day's events were a turning point, the moment when the silent accumulation of years of observation, restraint, and patience finally intersected with action, creating a space in which my voice, my presence, and my perspective could no longer be dismissed or overlooked, and I felt the unmistakable weight of authority that comes from knowing not only what is true, but also when and how to let it be revealed, a power that transforms simple words into catalysts for recognition, reflection, and inevitable, lasting change. The following morning began with a stillness that carried a weight I had not anticipated, a quiet that seemed almost deliberate, as though the world itself had paused to allow the repercussions of the previous night's message to settle into the consciousness of everyone involved, and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had not truly tasted, my mind racing through the possible outcomes of the conversation that was already unfolding behind the digital screen. Because I knew with absolute certainty that once a subtle disruption is introduced into a system as intricate and fragile as a family dynamic, there is no returning to the comfort of ignorance or pretense. And I realized that the advantage I had so carefully cultivated through patience and observation had positioned me to witness the reactions of those around me not through argument or confrontation, but through the raw honesty of their own unguarded responses. When my sister's call came, the tone of her voice was unmistakably different, not the usual casual familiarity with which she approached our interactions, but a careful deliberation that hinted at both anxiety and the dawning comprehension of consequences that extended beyond her immediate understanding. And I listened as she stumbled through explanations that were intended to frame our mother's distress as fleeting, inconsequential, or even self-inflicted, and I allowed her to speak. Uninterrupted, knowing that every word, every pause, every choice of phrasing revealed more about her awareness and her capacity to reckon with the truth than any argument I could make, because influence in situations like this is not about winning a debate, but about the slow, unavoidable recognition of reality. I responded in a manner that was deliberate, measured, and free from the overt emotional triggers that had been ignored for years, articulating observations and reflections that highlighted patterns she had long accepted as normal without ever questioning, and in doing so, I saw the subtle shift in her tone. The hesitation that indicated that she could no longer dismiss the implications of my words because they were rooted in fact, in history, and in the accumulation of attention and effort. That had been overlooked repeatedly, and I understood that true acknowledgement comes not from confrontation or assertion, but from a patient construction of evidence and perspective that becomes undeniable once it is framed with precision and clarity. Throughout the day, the undercurrent of tension was palpable even in spaces where words were not exchanged, and I observed the ways in which the dynamics of our family began to realign. How the unspoken understanding of my presence and significance started to permeate interactions that had previously been dominated by oversight and indifference. And I felt an almost imperceptible satisfaction in knowing that the years of quiet perseverance, the careful calibration of when to act and when to remain still, had brought me to a point where influence was exerted through subtle acknowledgement rather than confrontation, where patience had become the most powerful instrument of change, and where silence had finally evolved into authority. By the evening, our mother's demeanor had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. She moved through the house with a subtle alertness, her eyes carrying a weight of reflection that suggested she had been forced to confront decisions and actions she had long rationalized or ignored. And I understood that the quiet impact of the previous night's revelations was beginning to manifest in tangible ways, not through dramatic gestures or verbal declarations, but through the understated realignment of attention, emotion, and acknowledgement, and I realized that the subtlety of influence often has a potency far greater than the immediacy of confrontation, because it allows those involved to arrive at the truth through their own reasoning, internalizing it with a depth that reactionary responses rarely achieve. As the house settled into a quiet night, I reflected on the complex interplay of timing, awareness, and action that had brought me to this moment, recognizing that the careful accumulation of observation, patience, and restraint had created a foundation for authority that no single outburst or demonstration could have achieved, and I allowed myself to imagine the future interactions that would now be colored by the understanding that I was no longer invisible, that my perspective held weight, and that the carefully orchestrated sequence of actions had shifted the trajectory of family dynamics in a way that was inevitable, subtle, and deeply consequential, with the ripples of acknowledgement spreading in directions and with intensity that could not be undone. By the end of the night, the quiet revelation had transformed not only how my family perceived me, but also how they approached each other. The recognition of long-ignored efforts and contributions permeating conversations and gestures in ways that demanded reflection and recalibration, and I understood that the true measure of influence is not immediate gratification, but the enduring, cumulative acknowledgement of presence, value, and truth, which cannot be contested once it has been internalized, and that patience, observation, and precise action are the most formidable tools in shaping perception and commanding recognition, a lesson I had learned through years of careful strategy, now fully realized in the stillness of a home that had begun to reckon with the consequences of its own oversight. As I prepared for the next day, I carried with me the knowledge that the events of this single evening had irrevocably altered the landscape of our family interactions, establishing a quiet authority grounded not in force, but an undeniable presence and strategic clarity, and I understood with certainty that the path ahead would continue to unfold under this new dynamic, guided by the weight of truth, observation, and the inevitable recognition of contributions that had long been overlooked, a testament to the power of patience and deliberate action in reshaping relationships and establishing enduring influence. The morning arrived with an unsettling clarity, the kind that immediately imposes itself on your consciousness and leaves no room for distraction or pretense, and I found myself moving through the house with a heightened awareness of every sound, every shift in tone, every glance exchanged between family members, because after the sequence of events that had begun with subtle observation and careful patience, nothing could remain concealed, and the weight of unspoken truths now pressed on everyone in ways that demanded acknowledgement, whether they were ready or not, and I understood that the culmination of years of oversight, indifference, and misjudgment was now manifesting not in a single confrontation, but in a cascade of reactions that would expose intentions, priorities, and loyalties with an unflinching honesty that could not be ignored or deflected. By the time my sister called again, the tone of her voice had shifted entirely, leaving behind any pretense of composure and revealing a vulnerability that had been carefully suppressed for years. And I listened with measured attention as she attempted to rationalize the patterns of favoritism and oversight that had long defined our family interactions, trying to frame them as mere coincidence, misunderstandings, or miscommunication. Yet with every word, every hesitant pause, it became increasingly apparent that even she could no longer ignore the weight of evidence that had been presented and internalized, because the truth, once accumulated through patience, observation, and deliberate action, acquires a force that renders avoidance impossible, and I recognized that this moment was the inevitable intersection of strategy and consequence, where awareness could no longer be delayed without inviting acknowledgement. I responded with precision, carefully articulating the sequence of events, the context of each slight, the consistency of patterns that had been overlooked or dismissed for years, and in doing so, I observed the subtle shifts in her language, the moments where rationalization faltered and hesitation emerged, revealing a growing recognition that the reality she had long ignored was now undeniable, not because I demanded it, but because it had been presented in a manner so grounded in fact, so impossible to refute without self-deception, that her own perception could no longer maintain the comfortable illusions that had allowed her to disregard the consequences of prior actions. And I understood that influence often operates not through confrontation, but through carefully curated clarity that compels others to arrive at the truth themselves. Throughout the day, the atmosphere within the house transformed in imperceptible yet undeniable ways, and I observed the intricate ways in which attention, acknowledgement, and responsibility began to realign among family members who had previously operated under the assumption that their actions would go unnoticed or unchallenged, because once the consequences of consistent oversight are made evident, and once the cumulative weight of unrecognized efforts is made visible, it cannot be ignored. Without inviting a profound shift in behavior, perception, and interaction, and I recognized that the quiet authority I had cultivated through patience and observation was now exerting influence not through overt demonstration, but through the subtle, persistent force of acknowledgement that reshapes relationships from the inside out. By evening, the full scope of the changes was evident in the way our mother carried herself, the tone of her voice, the deliberate attention she now gave to details she had previously overlooked, and in the unguarded moments between family members. I could sense the recognition that the balance of influence had shifted, that the careful orchestration of observation and restraint had led to a point where acknowledgement of presence, effort, and truth could no longer be postponed, and I realized that the culmination of these subtle yet persistent shifts had created a new dynamic that demanded reflection, accountability, and a reconsideration of how interactions and contributions were perceived, a dynamic in which silence, patience, and precision wield more authority than argument, anger, or confrontation ever could. As the house settled into the quiet of night, I reflected on the path that had led me to this point, recognizing that every calculated act of restraint, every deliberate choice to observe rather than react. And every moment of patient strategy had contributed to the eventual unraveling of old assumptions and the realignment of recognition and respect. And I understood that influence is not measured in immediate results, dramatic gestures, or confrontational victories, but in the enduring acknowledgement of presence and value that, once established, cannot be denied, erased, or dismissed, and that true authority is most powerfully expressed not through noise, but through the inevitability of recognition that seeps into consciousness and reshapes behavior, priorities, and attention without overt enforcement. The culmination of this period of careful observation, deliberate restraint, and precise action left the family irrevocably altered, with the subtle but undeniable understanding that dynamics had shifted, that past oversights could no longer be ignored, and that the consequences of consistent acknowledgement, whether granted or withheld, carry a force that ultimately demands reckoning, reflection, and adjustment. And as I prepared to rest, I recognized that the unfolding of these events was not a matter of chance, anger, or vindication, but the natural outcome of deliberate patience, calculated perception, and the strategic application of truth, awareness, and timing, which together create an authority that cannot be contested, diminished, or reversed, leaving an enduring impression on both the structure and perception of relationships, the lessons of which would continue to resonate long after the immediate tension had subsided, and that the ultimate power lies not in the visible acts of confrontation, but in the silent, methodical accumulation of awareness and influence that reshapes realities, perceptions, and the trajectory of interaction in ways that cannot be undone. By the end of the night, the subtle yet undeniable authority I had cultivated had established itself firmly, leaving a permanent mark on the way family members perceived one another, approached interactions, and measured recognition, respect, and attention, and I understood with clarity that the combination of patience, observation, and strategic intervention has the power to alter not only immediate circumstances, but also the enduring patterns of influence and acknowledgement, a truth that is realized fully only through careful, deliberate, and unwavering execution over time, and I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the quiet triumph of presence and precision, knowing that the recalibration of recognition and influence within the family would continue to unfold under the inexorable weight of truth, awareness, and the inevitable acknowledgement of efforts that had long been overlooked, leaving a dynamic that, once established, could never again be taken for granted.